Yes, Frank and Ruth Johnson were dear friends of my parents. So I met them both at a very young age here in Montgomery, which is where I grew up. And at that age, this is probably mid-60s, of course I was not aware of his landmark rulings, not aware of his love of the Constitution, his reverence for the rule of law. Those became apparent to me much later. He was actually half of a 3-syllable word that I had made up in my mind, and based on what I had heard, and that 3-syllable word was Frankenruth. I had just combined the two into one, and they were one entity to me. They were a unit. And I have very vivid memories of early childhood interacting with him. He had a magical charm with children, also with animals, but that's another story. It was just amazing. If there were kids in the room, he would gravitate to the kids. He was engaging, he was playful, he was light. So that's how it began. I think the first memory I have of him, or one of the first, had to do with his shoes, a pair of shoes that he was wearing. My parents were having a social gathering at their house here in Montgomery, and he and Ruth came. He did what he always does, which is, come to me and have a conversation. I'm sure he made me laugh. I remember less about what we said and more about how he made me feel, which was always, and this was consistent throughout my adulthood. He just had a way of making you feel important, you mattered, you were worth listening to. But when I looked down, and I still have the visual in my head, he had on a pair of brown and white two-toned slip-on loafers. Now this was the early to mid-60s. I've not seen a pair since. I'm not sure I'd ever seen a pair before. They were brown on the outside and had a white shiny tongue that went over the top of the foot. But what struck me was there was no slot for the penny. Remember, penny loafers. And so that was just sort of his sporty side. But the larger point of the story is that he just had a way with kids, and really loved children, which I think says a lot about who he is, or who he was. I think when we interact with kids, our authentic selves come out, and I think that's who he was, a tremendously tender heart. One that really stands out in my mind, he and Ruth often traveled with my parents and me, because I was the last one of the brood, to their beach cottage, which was along the Gulf Coast, on the Gulf of Mexico, which everyone knows he loved it there. But he and I had a ritual where it was his idea, I'm sure, we would wake up very early in the morning before sunrise, and I would take my 2 plastic buckets, one in each hand. We would go to a special spot that he had picked out, and we would stand where the water meets the sand, and he would tell me to watch very closely, to be very quiet, and as the wave receded, to look down for tiny disappearing V's in the sand. And when we would see them, he'd say, "Now." And I'd go and I'd dig, and he wanted me to catch sand fleas. Those were these little, they're tiny crustaceans. I don't know what the genus classification is at all, but they're tiny little critters that are very skittish and very fast and hard to catch. But he would stand there until I had filled up both buckets of sand fleas. He used them for bait, for his, that was one of his favorite baits for fishing.
And he loved to fish.
He did, yes. You'll hear a lot about that. But looking back on that experience and others, he had a way of setting up a situation or an activity and giving me instructions, but stepping back and allowing me to complete it so that I felt the success at the end. This was one of those. I felt so included in the fishing expedition. I was the chief bait catcher, and we'd take the buckets and the bait back up to the house. But repeatedly, he would do those kinds of things, which I think is a very effective parenting tool, and it was innate. It was just a natural instinct for him. They were buddies. Frank was a prankster. He liked to play practical jokes, particularly on my dad, who was a little more serious. I always sensed that they had a very private relationship. I think that, especially during that turbulent time in the 60s, I think they were there for each other. I think it was a very supportive relationship, and mutually respectful. I think they both had tremendous respect for each other. But Daddy became very light around Frank, and Frank was always smiling, had a mischievous grin in social settings when he would come and join us for a holiday meal or join us on a vacation.
When you think about the two of them, what do you think drew them together? What was the commonality?
My dad was his physician, but I think that might have been later. And then I think the times, the state of affairs in Montgomery at that time. And I think also Frank and Ruth loved being around our big, crazy, loud family with all the kids. And then as I became an adult and I had kids, it continued. They were de facto family. For my brother and I'm the youngest of 5. My brother, who's right above me, Frank and Ruth were our legal guardians until we were 18. I guess my 3 older sisters had another one. So that was another connection, and I think another motivation to get to know us when we were young. I was younger, but I wasn't that young. The only memory I have is the morning after at the breakfast table, and I remember a smell of smoke around my mother. She still had it, I guess, on her, maybe in her hair, on her body. But I really don't remember it as the tragic event that it was. I don't think he was ever bitter about that. We were, kind of oddly happy that we would keep him here, right? We needed him here on the federal bench. The aneurysm took a while to heal. His recovery was more lengthy than he had expected and had been told by the surgeon, I believe. I don't think there was any bitterness. I think he was okay with it. And in fact, I recall Ruth saying that when he called her from Washington, and I think the Senate confirmations were complete, and I think it was, almost a done deal. He was not feeling well, and he told her that he had just made a mistake. So I think he was comfortable. He was at peace with it. And again, we had the benefit of him for so many more years. As a jurist, his notorious fairness in all of his cases across the board, from the voting rights cases on up, the mental health cases particularly, which Wyatt v. Stickney in '71, I think, I recall Ruth saying that he was the most proud of that one. But in his cases, I think he didn't see plaintiffs and defendants, he saw people. And it was always about the people involved. Yeah, I think Wyatt v. Stickney and that line of cases gets kind of overshadowed sometimes by the voting rights cases, which was, they were very, very important. But yeah, these were extraordinary. He established a patient bill of rights. I think he was the first federal judge to do that, which were lengthy. There were over 30 items, very specific, very detailed. He often, I think he was known for crafting very creative remedies in his rulings. Yeah, he helped me get my first job after college in one of the state institutions in Tuscaloosa, actually, that was still under a court order, his court order. It took them years and years to comply. It was Partlow. So the three hospitals were Bryce, Partlow, and Searcy that were under his order at that time through the Wyatt case. It was Wyatt v. Stickney in '71, and that line of cases after, because I had an interest in psychology. I was old enough to understand what that meant. But I do remember as a kid, a young kid, singing, and I cannot carry a tune, could not carry a tune, but I remember singing often, annoyingly, "We Shall Overcome." So I think, I felt the effects, and I knew on some level what was going on when I was young. But again, when he was with us, he was off duty for the most part. He was just an extraordinary human being. He had a creative side. He loved to build things. I have a memory as a child, once when he was vacationing with us at my parents' beach cottage. I had a new puppy, and my dog wouldn't, for some reason, eat the food that I was trying to feed him. And I was obviously distressed. Frank took the time to help me solve the mystery and figure out why this dog was not eating its food. So he decided that the dog needed a platform, or we needed to raise the dog dish off the floor. I have no reason why. It makes no sense to me. And maybe he was just joking and he was desperate for a solution to the problem. But I don't know what materials we used, but we built a little platform, raised the dog dish, and it worked. Now, knowing him and as an adult, I bet he had a treat in his pocket, or he found some cheese or turkey and stuck it in there and the dog ate. But again, back to what I was saying earlier, he would set the situation up and then step back and let me feel the success and the completion of it. I was just thrilled. Parenting, yes, yes. How I parented my kids. I mean, those were the subtle lessons, that we learn as children, and that not so subtly we then employ as a parent. So Nebuchadnezzar, I believe, was the Nebuchadnezzar. Thank you.
Your brother mentioned it.
Right. Was the one I remember the most. My interactions, when I would go over there, I would play and pet the dog. That inspired my mother to get a Doberman Pinscher as well, and so I think we had 2 after that. And then, of course, little Winston at the very end, before Frank died. It was the first small dog I think they'd ever had, but maybe a terrier. I don't know Winston's breed. But Winston was a lap dog. And of course, much easier to play with than the Doberman. He had that uncanny sense of he was a bit of a dog whisperer. Same with the children. There was just, he was a nurturer. And, he loved to build things. He loved to create things. His first job after, I think, high school was building outhouses in Winston County. And I think he learned construction and building from his grandfather, if I'm not mistaken. So he loved to create things, grow things. He had a beautiful rose garden. He had a creative spirit, artistic even. I mean, his woodwork. He was an artisan woodworker. We have beautiful pieces that he's made. For my husband and I, for our daughter, who's named after him, and for my parents, of course. And he was always so proud of the finish. It was like satin. It was so smooth, and he loved to talk about the finish and how he accomplished that on each piece he made. Strong moral compass, maybe. Doing the decent thing, the right thing. Also, having been through law school, reverence for the rule of law, which particularly recently that has been a big issue nationwide. He in his rulings, he often said he would extract emotion out of it. It was simply applying the law. He used to say, I was hired to apply the law. And he did, whether he agreed with it or not. That certainly has had a significant impact on me. I think he was born that way. I really do. When Ruth talks about, and they met in adolescence, and then, were together for so many years, the way she described him, he was always focused. Whether he was building outhouses or bookkeeping, he had a job bookkeeping, law school, in the war, as a lawyer, as a prosecutor, as a judge. I think he was just wired that way. And again, he would say that he did nothing extraordinary. He just applied the law. Well, as a judge, you you do what he did and apply the law. And those other things should not matter. He had a quote he was a Lincoln Republican. Now, Ruth was a New Deal Democrat, through and through. And remember, so I don't digress and then forget what I was going to say in answer to your question. She was liberal-minded. She was a feminist before her time, which I know rubbed off on him as a person and as a jurist. But he had a quote that he kept on his desk by Abraham Lincoln, and it went to what you just said. And I can't repeat, I wrote it down and brought it in, and I can get it for you. But essentially, that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what is going on out there. It is about the law. It is about the law, and that was his job. That's what he was charged with doing, and he did it well. I think Ruth told me, and I should probably know this, that he was only reversed once, which is an extraordinary track record. But you know, that's application of the law, and that's a judge's job. I think she deserves a lot of credit, at least to share in that legacy. She had tremendous empathy, tremendous compassion, always rooting for the underdog. She would call them mistreated. And they were together for, gosh, over 6 decades. So she was a vital force. I think she was a source of empowerment for him in many ways. I don't know that he ever talked over cases with her. I think she once said no. But her values, her personality traits, all of that certainly had an influence on who he was, both as a person and a judge. Ruth would say, yes, there is a legacy. And that says a lot about Ruth. Gosh, I mean, it's just speculation, but sure. I mean, he was, I think, wasn't it his grandfather who was nicknamed Straight Edge Johnson? I mean, he had that too, and I guess he would have had that no matter who was by his side. Maybe Ruth just helped him with that perspective that I mentioned earlier about considering the people involved, the people. Sticking to the letter of the law, but it was the people as well. Maybe her empathy softened him quite a bit. But yeah, he probably would still have that legacy. I know that, I mean, something may be surprising to people. It's not so much about Ruth, although Ruth always supported him in any of his endeavors at home, and he was quite the Renaissance man at home with his workshop, building beautiful pieces of furniture with his rose garden. He loved to watch birds in his backyard, you know, not with binoculars necessarily, but he had a bird feeder and he would always fill it. And when you think about fragile birds and you know, dainty roses and beautiful pieces of furniture and children who were growing, they both had such an appreciation for the vulnerable, people or animal or object. And that's empathy. Well, no, I wouldn't say that at all.
Yeah.
I would put it this way. He was very selective about who he surrounded himself with. He had friends, of course, people he trusted. This community has a lot of reparation to accomplish, and this effort is one of them. This oral history project is a step in the right direction. I remember Ruth telling me that they were avid churchgoers when they first moved here, First Baptist Church, I believe. And I don't know if you've heard this story, but it was around 1961, I guess, when the Freedom Riders were here testing the Boynton decision that desegregated the public transportation. And they drove up to church like they did every Sunday, and they noticed this Sunday that there was several deacons from the church lined up, technically blocking the door. Whether they were preventing Freedom Riders from coming in or others, no one knows. But Frank took one look and said, "Nope, not going in." Went back home, and Ruth told me that nearly every Sunday he could, he watched on television. I'm not sure which congregation, but he would watch church. That was back in the day when we had 3 television stations. And the invective that this community had had a horrible impact. Horrible impact. It would on anyone. But he once said, and this is kind of classic, I think the statement was, "You can't ostracize someone who ostracizes others." And what he meant by that was he knew who to befriend, he knew who to trust and who not to trust. So, at least verbally, he was okay with that. I think it did take a toll, of course, as it would on anyone. And I remember the bombing of his mom's house here. The cross burning Ruth would talk about in their yard. The nastiness, the viciousness, it's hard to comprehend. Oh, I'm sure they hurt. But there's that straight edge, perspective that he employed in the courtroom, making that statement. Well, you can't ostracize someone who ostracizes others. It was hatred. Again, all he was doing was applying the law. So that begs the question, why do people insist on breaking laws to serve their own purposes? I would say that he was such a humble man. All of this, the library, he would completely appreciate. The oral history project, I think he might get a kick out of. He might say it was unnecessary. It's a little too much of a spectacle. But deep down, he would be gratified. As Ruth said, over and over, they threw the mold away after Frank Johnson was made. Oh, I think it's vitally important, and I think that is a wonderful goal to strive for, particularly in this city, in this state, in the Southeast, but nationwide as well. I mean, every good lawyer in the country knows who Frank Johnson was and what he did. But you're right. I mean, we are getting older, and for the others who are coming up, I think it's vitally important.